In our last accounting, we observed the burgeoning power of Athens, a power that began to press relentlessly upon the Peloponnesian League, until at last, Sparta, having had quite enough of this escalating drama, overturned the diplomatic table, and so began the celebrated Peloponnesian War. But before we delve into the annals of this conflict, there is a matter of record we must first address. This was the first war in European history to be chronicled, in real time, by a contemporary historian. His name was Thucydides. This fellow was an Athenian, born around the year 460 BC, with his death estimated near 400 BC, a man whose entire lifespan appears, with a rather grim sense of cosmic irony, to have been a prelude to this very conflict. He was an eyewitness. He was a participant. He fought on the battlefield. He contracted the Great Plague, and when the war was lost, he was condemned to exile. It was during this exile that Thucydides, with meticulous and almost obsessive rigor, gathered his sources and composed his million-word masterwork, The History of the Peloponnesian War. Within its pages are passages of immortal genius. The Melian Dialogue, the funeral oration of Pericles. To this day, these texts remain foundational studies in universities and military academies across the globe. Now, since it was Sparta that first overturned the table, it was the Peloponnesian League that initiated hostilities. In the year 431 BC, the League member Thebes attacked Plataea, an ally of Athens. Towards the end of that same year, the de facto ruler of Athens, Pericles, delivered a speech at the public funeral for the first Athenian soldiers to fall. It was a passionate, canonical address, known to history as Pericles' funeral oration. In it, beyond eulogizing the sacrifice and valor of the fallen, and promising to care for their descendants, he offered a hymn of praise to the Athenian political system itself. He spoke thus: "Our constitution is called a democracy, because power is in the hands not of a minority, but of the whole people. When it is a question of settling private disputes, everyone is equal before the law. When it is a question of putting one person before another in positions of public responsibility, what counts is not membership of a particular class, but the actual ability which the man possesses. No one, so long as he has it in him to be of service to the state, is kept in political obscurity because of poverty." A truly formidable sentiment. It imbued the concepts of democracy and equality with a tangible, concrete meaning that has not faded with time. But let us be candid. Whether Athens at that moment truly lived up to this ideal for any but its aristocratic class, well, that is a matter known only to the heavens. The vast majority of the impoverished commons, to say nothing of the enslaved, would never have heard these words at all. Pericles concluded his oration with a resonant call to arms. The secret to happiness, he declared, is freedom, and the secret to freedom is courage. The subtext was perfectly clear. My children, for happiness, for freedom, you must be brave. You must go and meet the Spartans on the field of battle. And yet, for all its rhetorical splendor, it seems the gods were not entirely impressed. In the second year of the war, a great plague descended upon Athens, and Pericles himself, most unfortunately, was among its victims. To be fair, one cannot lay the blame entirely at the feet of the gods. Pericles bore a certain responsibility. You see, Athens' advantage was its navy, Sparta's was its heavy infantry. Each Spartan hoplite was a monster armed to the teeth, his breastplate alone weighing over 20 pounds, attended by half a dozen slaves for foraging, cooking, and other daily drudgeries. The Athenians, quite sensibly, preferred not to face such a terrifying force in open combat. Pericles' strategy was twofold. First, the Athenian navy would blockade Spartan ports, strangling their maritime trade. Second, he would evacuate the farmers from the surrounding countryside into the city of Athens itself. The city's supplies would be guaranteed by grain shipments brought in via the famous long walls. But Pericles overlooked a colossal problem: public sanitation. It is a challenge that vexes even the modern metropolis. Every human being is a generator of waste, and a single day without collection can render entire districts foul. The dramatic surge in Athens' population led inevitably to environmental pollution, which was very likely the wellspring of the plague. Today, we no longer know the precise nature of this great plague of 430 BC. Was it a form of bubonic plague, influenza, or some primordial coronavirus? The data, as they say, is lost. We know only that a quarter of the population perished, and that Pericles was among them. A popular account holds that the plague was finally contained by the man known as the father of medicine, Hippocrates, who, by a remarkable coincidence, was also born in 460 BC. Hippocrates was a student of Democritus, the philosopher who proposed the theory of atomism. Armed with this proto-materialist worldview that the world is composed of atoms, the medically minded Hippocrates naturally rejected the notion that disease was the wrath of the gods or some other supernatural force. He held fast to the belief that sickness was a product of environment, diet, and daily habits. This viewpoint effectively extracted medicine from the realms of theology and philosophy, establishing it as a discipline in its own right. For this alone, the title Father of Medicine seems entirely fitting. The story goes that after observing the city, Hippocrates noticed that the blacksmiths, who worked constantly by their forges, were not falling ill. They were, in a word, thriving. He therefore instructed every household in Athens to light fires. And by this method, he brought the epidemic under control. The science, of course, is sound. A virus is encased in a fragile protein shell. Raise the temperature. The shell melts, and the virus dies. Regrettably, this is only a legend. We cannot confirm today whether Hippocrates did this, or if the plague's retreat was his doing at all. Historical records concerning him, outside of the medical texts of the Hippocratic corpus, are scarce. Both Plato and Aristotle mention him in their works, always with the reverent honorific, the great Hippocrates. But as to why he was great, or what precisely he did, the two philosophers remain silent. Associated with Hippocrates is an oath, the physician's oath, often called the Hippocratic Oath. It is a vow made before the gods, outlining what a doctor should and should not do. While he may not have written it, and some of its tenets are no longer applicable, much of its core remains a pillar of medical ethics, the duty to treat all patients equally. The sacred trust of patient confidentiality. My final word on this medical master is this: if we could confirm that Hippocrates did indeed perform these deeds, then we must conclude that ancient Greece achieved a standard of both medical practice and medical ethics that is, frankly, breathtaking. To return to our narrative. After Pericles died, a man named Cleon rose to power as the leader of Athens. He was a fanatical proponent of radical democracy and aggressive expansionism. Under his incitement, Athens chose to continue its deathmatch with Sparta. This continued until the year 422 BC, when Cleon was killed in the Battle of Amphipolis. His death presented an opportunity. Under the stewardship of a general named Nicias, Athens signed a treaty with Sparta. It was called the Peace of Nicias, a pact intended to last for 50 years, a promise that, for the rest of their natural lives, they would not go to war again. It is a pity, then, that neither Athens nor Sparta took the treaty seriously. After the signing, neither side returned the lands and ports they had captured, as the terms stipulated. Much like the 30-year truce before it, the Peace of Nicias was, for all intents and purposes, a worthless piece of paper. So, if anyone ever tries to persuade you that the ancient Greeks, by virtue of their maritime trade, possessed an innate spirit of contractual obligation, you may confidently counter with the example of the Peace of Nicias. Not only did they ignore the treaty, but the Athenian assembly, swayed by the charismatic and hawkish aristocrat Alcibiades, decided to once again make war on Sparta. and to do so immediately. This reveals a peculiar characteristic of the Athenian assembly. Whoever could spin the most convincing tale would win the day. Historians now have a term for this political phenomenon: a system where success is achieved through populist persuasion. They call it plaza politics. It is a timeless political truth, where reason fails to persuade. A good story will always suffice, and in the summer of 422 BC, the aristocrat Alcibiades spun a very successful tale indeed, stirred by his rhetoric. The Athenians decided to embark on their most daring adventure yet, the Sicilian expedition. A glance at a map reveals that the island of Sicily is a very long way from the Peloponnesian peninsula. But under Alcibiades' spell, the Athenians were convinced. This expedition, he argued, would not only seize the island's grain, but would also create a naval encirclement of Sparta. The grand strategy was set. First, however, they would dispatch a force to conquer a small island to the south, the island of Melos. This, at least, was a logical step. As the map shows, Melos lies on the direct sea route from Athens to Sicily, a necessary stop if one wished to bypass Spartan territory. The Athenian fleet arrived at Melos. In keeping with the principle of extending a courtesy before commencing hostilities, they sent an envoy to demand the island's surrender. The Melians were, to put it mildly, baffled. "We are members of neither your Delian League nor the Peloponnesian League," they protested. "We live on this small island, fishing and shrimping and drinking coconut juice. Bothering no one. Why have you come to attack us?" According to Thucydides' history, the Athenian envoy's reply was this: "We shall not waste time with suspicions about the future, or with any other matter, but that which is practical and before your eyes, which is how to save your city from destruction. If you are serious, our discussion may proceed." What does this mean, you ask? It means, in essence, a single brutal sentence: "We strike you because we can. Reason is not required." Then, the Athenian envoys laid out their terms. Surrender, pay a handsome annual tribute to Athens. The Melians, indignant, shot back. And what do we receive in return? The answer was as clear as it was monstrous: the privilege of not being annihilated. The envoy elaborated: "Our attack on you now is not because you have done us any wrong. We both know that the question of right is only ever debated between equals in power. In the world as it truly is, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." The Melians, possessed of considerable backbone, refused the Athenian terms. The ending, however, was not a happy one. The Athenians breached their walls, executed every adult male, and then settled 50,000 of their own citizens on the island, enslaving the remaining Melian women and children. Then, the grand fleet set sail to conquer Sicily. The account you have just heard is from that immortal passage in Thucydides' work, the Melian Dialogue. As for how Thucydides came to know the precise details of this conversation, we cannot say. It is, in the end, irrelevant. What is important is that he vividly depicted the sheer gangsterism of Athens in that era. To this very day, short of finding a powerful protector, humanity has not discovered a second method by which Melos might have avoided its doom. One might wonder, how could Athens, the celebrated democratic city-state, commit such an unconscionable act? The truth is twofold. First, a state's internal democracy has absolutely no bearing on its foreign aggression. Second, this was true in history, and it remains true in the world today. In the pages of Thucydides, Athens was the oppressor of the Hellenic world. He wrote, "The majority of states sided with Sparta, for Sparta proclaimed herself the liberator of Hellas. Most of the Greeks hated Athens, some wishing to escape her rule, others fearing they would fall under it." Connected to the doomed island of Melos is one of the most famous works of art in existence, a statue with two missing arms, the Venus de Milo. In 1820, a peasant unearthed it from a field on Melos and later presented it to the French king, Louis XVIII. It now resides in the Louvre. The statue is believed to depict Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love and beauty. As it was created during the Roman era, it bears her Roman name, Venus. Modern studies date it to between 130 and 100 BC. The question of why it is a classic, beyond the considerable French marketing effort that followed its discovery, involves an artistic concept known as the golden ratio. What is the golden ratio? It is a matter of proportion. According to aesthetic theory, it is the most perfect, harmonious, and stable of forms. If the ratio of your lower body to your upper body is 1.618, and the ratio of your total height to your lower body is also 1/618, then your form possesses this golden mean. The Venus de Milo is precisely so constructed. Of course, this pertains merely to verticality. One imagines that when selecting a partner, you might also consider their horizontal proportions. A golden ratio there might prove somewhat less aesthetically pleasing. The first to study this ratio was also an ancient Greek, a man named Euclid. It must be said that ancient Greece produced two brilliant men named Euclid. One was a philosopher, Euclid of Megara. The other, the one we speak of now, was a mathematician, Euclid of Alexandria, the father of geometry. He compiled a book called The Elements. In it, he pioneered the axiomatic method, establishing a set of basic, self-evident propositions or axioms that require no proof. All other propositions or theorems must then be proven using only these axioms. This method became the gold standard of logical proof for the next 2,000 years, profoundly shaping the Western mode of thought. Archaeological research suggests that by the time the Venus de Milo was sculpted, Euclid's Elements was widely circulated. It is therefore likely the sculptor consciously applied the golden ratio. Of course, it is also possible the sculptor was an illiterate genius who had never read the book. In that case, we are left to marvel at a creator of innate, untutored aesthetic perfection. But let us return to the Athenians, fresh from their rampage on Melos. They were advancing on Sicily, full of confidence and swagger. Their expedition, however, was not a success, and the reason for its failure, one could argue, was Athenian democracy itself. For while Alcibiades and his army sailed for Sicily, the citizens' assembly back in Athens was consumed by a debate. The sacred statues of the god Hermes throughout the city had been vandalized. Who was the culprit? After a vigorous session of plaza politics, the majority of Athenians became convinced it must have been Alcibiades before he departed. That man, they said, has always been disrespectful of the gods, and so what was to be done? The assembly reached a decision of breathtaking perversity. The expedition was to be recalled, the commander was to be arrested and put on trial. A verdict of death and confiscation of property was not only considered, but widely favored. When Alcibiades received this news, he was understandably terrified. His only recourse was to defect. He fled to Sparta, where he proceeded to divulge every detail of the Athenian war plan. This left the Athenian expeditionary force with a single commander, the aforementioned Nicias, the man who had signed the 50-year peace. His talents as a general were to be charitable, modest. Without Alcibiades, he lost his nerve. In 413 BC, in a naval battle off Syracuse, the Athenian fleet was utterly defeated. Nicias was captured. Some say he took his own life, others that he was beheaded. In either case, his campaign was over. Now one would expect Sparta, with Athens so grievously wounded, to tear up the treaty and attack. But what happened was quite the opposite. Sparta remained quiet. It was Athens in the following year, depleted and without provocation, that decided, after yet another debate in the assembly, to launch a surprise attack on Sparta. Perhaps they believed what was lost in Sicily could be reclaimed from the Spartans. History did not indulge this act of spectacular self-destruction. In the ensuing years of fighting, Sparta's strategy proved superior. They allied with Persia, built up their navy to address their weakness, and encouraged city-states oppressed by Athens to defect from the Delian League. Athens, in contrast, was consumed by internal chaos. In the spring of 411 BC, an oligarchic coup was staged. A council of 400 was established to bring order. Months later, the political winds shifted once more. The council, it was argued, had betrayed the democratic spirit, and so the council was overthrown. Its members were sentenced to death. A full year was thus consumed by this magnificent bout of self-harm. Then, in 406 BC, the Athenian navy achieved the impossible. They met the Spartans in a ferocious sea battle and won a stunning, decisive victory. They had saved the fleet. They had preserved the state. They had returned as heroes. And for this, all 8 victorious generals were recalled to Athens and put on trial. The charge: failing to rescue shipwrecked Athenian sailors during the battle. In truth, the weather conditions had made any rescue attempt suicidal, but the assembly, brandishing the slogan, "Every sailor's life is sacred," would not be reasoned with. 6 of the 8 generals were executed. In a single act, Athens had liquidated its most experienced military minds. The Spartans could scarcely believe their luck. After this relentless series of self-inflicted wounds, Athens could hold out no longer. 1 year after the execution of its generals, in the spring of 404 BC, the Athenian fleet was defeated on its own doorstep. The port was blockaded. The Athenians had no choice but to open their gates and surrender. And so, the Peloponnesian War, which had raged for 27 years, ended with the total capitulation of Athens. The Delian League was dissolved. Athens was disarmed. Permitted to keep only 12 ships, Athens rose by democracy, and it fell by democracy. Its rise gave the world an unparalleled flourishing of philosophy, medicine, and science, but its fall offers a chilling warning. A democracy that becomes too broad, too excessive, and too unconstrained is a dangerous thing. When an assembly of citizens can, without due process of law, sentence its own generals to death at a moment's notice, its leaders have no choice but to pander to the whims, the greed, and the foolishness of the crowd. Unchecked democracy, Athens demonstrated, is merely another name for the tyranny of the majority after the surrender. Sparta's allies, Thebes and Corinth, argued that Athens should be utterly destroyed, its men executed, its women and children enslaved, just as Athens had done to others. But Sparta refused. Their king, Lysander, reasoned that the destruction of Athens would create a power vacuum, to prevent another power from filling it. Sparta would have to garrison the region at ruinous expense. Far better, he concluded, to preserve a subjugated Athens. It was a remarkably shrewd calculation, proving that the most profitable form of control is not annihilation, but management. But there was another, more pressing reason. Sparta had made many promises to its Persian allies during the war. Promises it now had no intention of keeping, and if one plans to default on a deal with an empire, one had best prepare for a fight. Sparta knew a war with Persia was inevitable. They could not afford to push Athens too far. One day, they might even need them as an ally. And so, Sparta installed a proxy government, a group that would enter the annals of history as the 30 Tyrants. Though Athenian by birth, they were fanatical admirers of the Spartan political system. Their leaders were 2 men named Critias and Charmides. They also shared another identity. They were both former students of Socrates. Now, Socrates the philosopher we have met. But if you imagine he was a champion of Athenian democracy, you are quite mistaken. The old man was deeply skeptical of mass participation in politics. Knowledge, not majority rule, should be the basis of governance, he often argued. The business of statecraft should be left to the experts. It is no surprise, then, that his students, including Plato, harbored various critiques of the democratic system. Critias and Charmides were the most extreme. But where democracy can lead to the tyranny of the majority, autocracy, it must be said, offers a far more direct route to the tyranny of the few. in just 8 months. The 30 tyrants executed 1,500 Athenian citizens and confiscated their property. After 8 months, they were stopped, not because they had a change of heart, but because the Athenian people revolted, overthrew them, and put Critias and Charmides to the sword, and the Spartans, they did not intervene, so long as Athens remained subservient and paid its tribute. They cared little who was in charge. Besides, they were busy preparing for a major war with Persia, but the affair was not over. After executing the 30 tyrants, the Athenians turned their attention to another man they deemed culpable, Socrates. Why, they asked, were your most prominent students such enemies of democracy? Say no more. Socrates was hauled before the court. The old man, now 70, spoke eloquently in his own defense, insisting on his innocence. But Socrates, for all his genius, suffered from a deficit in psychology. He failed to realize that the more masterfully he spoke, the more eloquently he argued, the more he proved the very charge against him. That he was a master of sophistry, a corrupter of the youth. The jurors looked at this man, capable of spinning any argument, and thought, my own son would surely be led astray by such a fellow. In the end, the man hailed as the greatest philosopher of ancient Greece was sentenced to death. Socrates had an opportunity to escape. His students had bribed the guards. But he refused. To flee, he argued, would be to disobey the laws of his own city-state, to violate the social contract. It would betray everything he had ever taught. And so, he took the cup of hemlock, drank it down, and with his final breath, uttered a cryptic last request. Crito, he said, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Please don't forget to pay the debt. Asclepius was not his neighbor, he was the god of healing. In Greek custom, one sacrificed a cock to him upon being cured of an illness. Socrates' meaning was clear. Death for him was a kind of cure, a release from the sickness of life. The philosopher Nietzsche would later distill this sentiment into a famous aphorism. To live is to be ill. The death of Socrates is often considered the second great tragedy of the individual in the Western canon, after that of Jesus Christ. It is also the most damning indictment of Athenian democracy. As James Madison, a father of the American Constitution, would later write, had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. The Peloponnesian War laid waste to the entire Balkan Peninsula. It marks the beginning of the decline of the glorious classical Greek civilization, which would soon be conquered by a nation from the north. But first, let us ask a question. Was this war inevitable, according to the historian Thucydides? The answer is yes, absolutely. He wrote, it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. He also noted that both sides entered the conflict with high hopes, each man eager to prove his valor. This reveals two truths. First, one mountain cannot abide two tigers, and second, neither side believed itself to be the weaker of the two. In 2012, the American scholar Graham Allison further refined this idea, stating that a rising power will inevitably challenge an established one, and the established power will inevitably respond. This is what we now call the Thucydides trap, a term often used to describe the tense relationship between the United States and China. Is the Thucydides trap a valid theory? From a historical perspective, the answer is pessimistically yes. Allison studied 16 instances in history where a rising power challenged a dominant one. 12 of them resulted in war. Why? There are two primary drivers. The first is the security dilemma. The established power, fearing the loss of its position, will take aggressive measures to suppress the challenger. The challenger, facing this suppression, feels it has no choice but to fight for its survival. The second reason is what the writer Liu Cixin termed the chain of suspicion. Sparta could never truly know Athens' ultimate ambition. Did they want to share power or usurp it entirely? And no matter what Athens said, Sparta would never believe it. Likewise, Athens could never know if Sparta would tolerate its existence. Even if both sides had peaceful intentions, neither could ever be sure of the other's true thoughts. And even if you believe your rival is peaceful, can you be sure they don't suspect you of aggression? And if they do suspect you, might they not strike first out of fear? This chain of suspicion can extend infinitely, until, inevitably, one side slams its fist on the table and declares, "Enough, I will not guess anymore, I will destroy you and be done with it." How then does one escape the trap? One brutal method is a balance of terror, where both sides possess the capacity for mutual annihilation, and both sides clearly signal that any conflict will result in it. This is the logic of nuclear deterrence. There are, however, two less bloody precedents. The first was the peaceful handover of global leadership from Great Britain to the United States after World War II. Britain was simply too exhausted and battered by two world wars to resist. The second was the end of the Cold War, which concluded with the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was not a military victory, but a case of one protagonist collapsing from internal exhaustion. After Athens' surrender, its former allies Thebes and Corinth grew resentful. They had gained little from the victory, while Sparta had grown arrogant and disrespectful. And so, 9 years after the end of the Peloponnesian War, in 395 BC, they formed a new alliance with Athens and others to challenge Spartan dominance. This was the Corinthian War. Persia, seeing a chance to sow chaos among the Greeks, happily funded the new alliance, which promptly defeated the Spartan navy and even their vaunted infantry. Beaten and bruised, Sparta resorted to diplomacy. They went to the Persians and asked a simple question: "If we fall, are you certain this new Greek alliance will give you a better deal than we can?" The Persians, realizing that a divided Greece was in their best interest, switched their support back to Sparta. The new alliance, weakened, was forced to the negotiating table. The resulting treaty was a humiliation for Greece. Sparta sacrificed all the Greek colonies in Asia Minor to Persia in exchange for Persian support of its hegemony. But Sparta's decline was now irreversible. Decades of war and growing internal inequality had crippled its economy and depleted its population. In 371 BC, Sparta was decisively defeated by the rising power of Thebes and faded from the stage as a major power. It had, quite simply, exhausted itself through endless warfare. At the same time, Athens was also in decay. With its empire gone, its trade collapsed. As a city-state heavily reliant on commerce for basic necessities like timber, wax, and especially grain, this was a death blow. Between 413 and 400 BC, trade through its main port fell by nearly 2/3. The slow death of the old Greek powers created an opening for a kingdom to the north. Macedon. Unlike the Greek city-states, Macedon was a monarchy, a system the Athenians often derided as barbaric, but the Macedonians were shrewd. During the earlier Persian wars, they had feigned allegiance to Persia while secretly feeding intelligence to the Greeks. During the Peloponnesian War, while Athens and Sparta bled each other dry, Macedon grew rich selling timber and other war materials to both sides. With a business acumen that would make a modern arms dealer proud, they profited immensely from the conflict that was destroying their neighbors. By the time the war was over, Macedon was an emerging power, and in 359 BC, a man ascended to its throne who would complete its rise. His name was Philip II. He was the brother of the previous king who had been killed in battle. Seeing his infant nephew on the throne, Philip concluded, with a heavy heart no doubt, that it was his solemn duty as an uncle to relieve the child of this heavy burden. He deposed his nephew and took the crown for himself. Philip quickly proved to be a military genius. He created a new type of fighting unit, the Macedonian phalanx. It was a square formation of 256 men, 16 by 16, each armed with an immense 20-foot spear called a sarissa. In an age of short swords, The sight of a forest of these pikes advancing at a run was enough to break the nerve of any army. With this formation, Philip conquered his neighbors and then turned his sights south, towards Greece. In 338 BC, he met a coalition of Greek forces led by Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea. The result was a decisive victory for Macedon. The most tragic end was met by the Theban Sacred Band, an elite unit of 300 soldiers comprised of 150 male couples. In previous battles, the power of their bond had made them invincible, but at Chaeronea, they were met by a young man leading the Macedonian cavalry. His name was Alexander. In both East and West, he is known by another name, Alexander the Great. Alexander was Philip's son. He was given the finest education, tutored by none other than the great philosopher Aristotle himself. Aristotle, born in Macedon, had been Plato's star pupil at the academy in Athens for 20 years. But while Plato was a man of ideas, of the abstract, Aristotle was a man of the world, of the concrete. The great Renaissance painter Raphael captured this difference perfectly in his fresco. The School of Athens. At its center stand Plato, pointing to the heavens, and Aristotle, gesturing towards the earth. Perhaps Aristotle's greatest contribution was to formally separate the study of the physical world, biology, physics, zoology, from the study of the non-physical world of thought and being. He essentially carved out a new discipline from the all-encompassing Greek concept of philosophia, or love of wisdom. He wrote a book on this subject titled after the physics. From this, we derive the term metaphysics, and with it, Western philosophy as a distinct field of inquiry was truly born.